So, in the old days, there used to be certainly 50 years ago or more, before the Qumran scrolls had an impact on our thinking, there's a very simplistic model of ancient Judaism. Right. So ancient Judaism begins over here, wherever you think ancient Judaism begins. The question I will not discuss at the moment. Right. And then it doodles along. Right. And we have Judaism here. We can point to various moments of significance. Here are the Hasmoneans. Here's the destruction of the temple. Here's the war of Bar Kokhba. And we have something called Judaism which comes along and ultimately gives us the rabbis and rabbinic Judaism and the Mishnah and the Talmud and every other kind of Judaism that I find familiar and recognize. Then, of course, along the way, we have various, pardon the expression, deviants. Right? Most famously, of course, will be Christians. Right? Who depart from the true path, if indeed that's your team. Depart from the true path, or if that's not your team, you probably would phrase it differently, right? But the Christians, they deviate. They go off and do something. So they were once part of Judaism, and then something happens, and they're not. And similarly, one can point to other sects and parties and movements and say that, whereas the one true holy Judaism just continues to march onward. Right? And indeed, if you are a pious traditional Jew, brought up in a traditional education, you will probably be taught some version of this in school to this very day. That there is one sacred Judaism that begins with Moses at Mount Sinai over here and goes straight down through the rabbinic sages through the generations. And we've had a number of losses along the way because of deviance, but ultimately they are of no consequence. Now, as we want to get more politically correct, people realize this perhaps is not the most historically informed way of understanding the history of Judaism. So then we start to get other models. So another model might be, we begin with Judaism over here. Right, so this is Judaism. Right, and this is Christianity. Right, the advantage here is to realize that what we call Judaism actually goes back to a kind of Judaism, and what we call Christianity also was once Judaism. And in fact, it's not clear by what criterion I can say this one is more legitimate or authentic than this one. In fact, I have to start to come up with interesting criteria by which I would explain continuity and discontinuity. Fully realizing, of course, that the Judaism of the year 100 or 200 or 500 CE is not the same as the Judaism of 100 BCE or 200 BCE. Right? Dramatic changes have happened, whether we like it or not. And after all, doesn't Christianity claim to be Israel? Doesn't Christianity read the Old Testament? Doesn't that count for something? So, in this model, then, we realize that there are competing Judaisms. Right? And then the modern scholars began to use the word Judaisms in the plural. Now, once we factor in the Qumran scrolls, we realize that even this model is woefully simple. Right? This model, while I think an improvement over the other in the sense of sensitizing us to issues of continuity and authenticity and not making, in effect, faith statements and pretending that these are historical statements, nonetheless, the Qumran scrolls show us we have a far more complicated picture. It's not simply that we have Judaism which comes along and splits into rabbinic Judaism, and Christianity. Rather, we seem to have a far more complicated diagram. I'm not even sure how to draw this diagram. Right? We seem to have a series of parallel lines or parallel groups, all of which constitute Judaism somehow. But we have our Enoch friends with their vision of what Judaism is, and a rather distinctive vision it is. We have our Qumran friends, our Qumran sectarians. We have other documents among the Qumran sectarians. I'd like to figure out how to situate these documents in society, notably the Book of Jubilees, for example. If I could figure out who wrote the Book of Jubilees, I would have figured out a very important crack, a very important puzzle. Nobody knows who wrote the Book of Jubilees. If I could figure that out, I would understand a lot about ancient Judaism, which we just don't know. Similar to a temple scroll, various other documents. I got to figure out where these come from. These have very distinctive voices and very distinctive visions. I have all these varieties. And somehow, through a mysterious process which is hard to describe, we wind up with Rabbinic Judaism over here and Christianity over there, both of which are drawing on a number of these sources in different and complex ways. Well, that's what the Qumran scrolls show me, that my old maps were too simple, right? That in fact it's infinitely richer and far more varied than I could have possibly have realized until I found the Qumran scrolls. Now the evidence is staring me in the face. I can't deny it. I can't pretend otherwise. There it is. That's the big picture. And then we'll come back to this in several times throughout the rest of the coming weeks. And that's what I mean by explains the background to Christianity. It gives me a much richer portrait of the stuff from which Christianity drew. The stuff out of which Christianity emerged. And indeed, I would say right away, the stuff out of which Rabbinic Judaism emerged. The stuff upon which the rabbis drew when they create their vision of Judaism. And more or less the same time, Christians are creating their new Judaism, which we call Christianity. Okay, quick question or two. Yes, ma'am.
So I kind of lost track of all what was published in all those readings we did. But since so much of it was translated or published since the 1990s,
Right.
how much of this is really, really new understandings and how much has been known?
Okay, how much this is really, really new. This portrait, this picture, has gotten more widely accepted in the last 20 years, I would say. It was around already long before that. There was enough stuff out there already that scholars were already intuiting that, in fact, a simple vision, there was something called Judaism and deviant heretical groups, right, realizing this is not the way things were. This is woefully simplistic and probably just plain wrong. There was enough already out there, but the Qumran scrolls make it unavoidable, i.e. you can't read this book, wherever that is, okay. Yes, you can't read this book and pretend there is a single something called Judaism that everybody agrees upon what Judaism is. I mean, you can't. You read this book and you realize, I'm bewildered. You know, what are these people saying and believing and doing? In that sense, it makes it hit you over the head with the proverbial ton of bricks that, you know, you catches your attention and it won't let go.